Hello and welcome to Edexcel 9 to 1 GCSE History Revision. We're going to be focusing on Paper 3, Weimar and Nazi Germany, and today's question will be, how far did German people support the events of Kristallnacht 1938? And we're going to jump straight into a timeline covering the history of anti-Semitism in Germany, then focusing on Kristallnacht in the form of a source question and some interpretation questions. What's important to note with Germany is that they were not the first group of people to persecute the Jews. As long as there has been conflict between Jews and other religions, there has been anti-Semitism. For example, under the Romans, even though it was the Romans who executed Jesus, the Jews were blamed for the death of Christ. Due to their refusal to become Christian, the Jews were put into ghettos in the Middle Ages in England. They were also accused of assassinating members of the royal family in Russia, and they were driven out of Russia towards the end of the 1800s. And they were also accused of betraying Germany in World War I with the Dolchstoß stab in the back. So when Hitler comes to power in 1933, he knows that there is hatred towards the Jews. He himself has hatred towards the Jews, and he uses this in many of his elections and many of his sort of election campaigns. In 1932, Hitler received 37% of the vote in the Reichstag, and much of his propaganda was aimed at blaming much of Germany's problems on the Jewish community. He passed the Enabling Act in March 1933, and on the 1st of April 1933 began. Even though the boycott of Jewish businesses only lasted for 24 hours on the 1st of April 1933 to the 2nd of April 1933, it set the tone for much of the anti-Semitic laws or much of the anti-Semitic legislation which the Nazis were about to pass. They portrayed the message that Germans should only employ Aryan people, and this, as a result, excluded many Jews from businesses, industries and employment. In the 1930s, there were approximately 600,000 Jews living in Germany, and between 1933 and the mid-1940s, whilst the Nazis were in charge, approximately 400 pieces of legislation, 400 laws, were put in place to restrict the living conditions and the lifestyle of Jewish people. In 1935, they were segregated. This means they were separated from Germans in civil service, universities, the medical and legal profession. One of the main laws introduced against Jews living in Germany were the Neumberg Laws. Here in 1935, Jews had their German citizenship removed. This could potentially result in marriages being cancelled or annulled between Jews and non-Jews. And this was an attempt to cleanse, or in Hitler's words, cleanse Jewish bloodlines out of Germany. And this was part of his Aryanization program, essentially removing Jewish genes. Even though there were stories in most of the world's newspapers about what the Nazis were doing in Germany, Hitler tried to pretend that he was a good leader in 1936 when, during the hosting of the Nazi Olympics, or the Berlin Olympics, all Jews' unwelcome signs were removed. There was very little evidence of anti-Semitism. However, what was very clear is that A, there were no actual German Jewish athletes taking part in the Olympics. B, many of the athletes representing Germany were of Aryan appearance, blonde hair, blue eyes. And C, the Americans even understood Hitler's hatred towards the Jews and actually replaced some of their own Jewish athletes with non-Jewish athletes. So it was very clear that there was a high level of anti-Semitism in Germany in 1930. By 1937 and 1938, ID cards and passports were introduced for Jews, whereby they would have to register any property that they would own, and that would later be confiscated by the German government. Jewish workers were fired by their employers. Businesses were taken over by Aryans, by Germans, and their passports were stamped with the letter J. Again, all identifying that Jews and Germans were unequal in the eyes of the Nazis. And now the main focus of this video is Kristallnacht, and just to give you a little bit of context, due to the tension between Jews and Germans in the 1930s, there was an attack on a Nazi official by a German Jew in Paris in 1938 in November. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, the black shirts, Hitler's private bodyguard, then proceeded to attack the hometown of the German Jew in Hanover. Now, what's very typical of life in Germany at this time is that these attacks were not just isolated to Hanover, the hometown of the German Jew who attacked the Nazi, but there was such a high level of anti-Semitism in Germany that actually violence begins to spread all over the country. Homes, businesses, synagogues, even people attacked by SS in plain clothes, ordinary German people, and what was probably more offensive is that the Jews were forced to repair the damage. Not only was the Jewish community fined for the murder of the Nazi official, but they were also fined for the damage that had been sustained on their community. Businesses that couldn't be repaired by Jews were then taken over by Germans at a cut price rate. Therefore, Kristallnacht just demonstrated how much hatred there was towards the Jewish community, given the fact that, one, the violence spreads from Hanover all across Germany, and two, the ordinary people took part in this violence. In 1939, all Jews had to change their name legally to either Israel if they were a male or Sarah if they were a female. This was followed closely by the invasion of Poland in September, whereby many of the residents of Poland were Jewish, and in total there were 3 million Jews that were either transported to concentration camps like Auschwitz or death camps like Birkenau, whereby most of them were systematically exterminated by the Nazis. And this extermination of the Jewish race by the Nazis comes under the final solution, which is decided at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. Here, Himmler on your left-hand side and Reinhard Heydrich on the right-hand side decided that the final solution, the ultimate sort of end to the Jewish race, was to build more death camps, labelling them as Untermenschen, undesirables, and between 1942 and 1945, 6 million Jews were taken to concentration camps, mainly places like Birkenau or Treblinka, and unfortunately were either put to work, whereby many of them would have been worked to death, or were sent for a shower and would never have returned home. Let's try and apply some of that knowledge to the different questions. Remember, there are 52 marks available on paper 3, and 36 of those marks, that's roughly 2/3 of the paper, come from section 3. Remember, 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, they are all on the same topic. So let's take 3A, study sources B and C. How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the level of public support towards Kristallnacht 1938? Apologies there for the typo in the question. This is an 8 marker, not a 4 marker. So for an 8 marker for the source question, this is the same as paper 1. You will need to do 3 things. You will need to engage with the source, which is the purple strand. You will need to look at the provenance of the source and why that is useful for this particular inquiry. That's the blue strand. And provide supporting old knowledge. That's the red strand. Remember, it's going to be very difficult for you to get any more than half marks if you don't have all 3. Let's just take this first source. So this is Paul Briscoe, My Friend the Enemy, an English Boy in Nazi Germany, 2007. And Paul is recalling what happened during Kristallnacht 1938. Now, if you have a look on the right-hand side, you can see that this candidate has used a quote. So there is direct interaction with the source. They've talked about the provenance and they've linked that back to the inquiry. And they've also used a little bit of supporting old knowledge. So this would tick all 3 boxes. Remember, you only have maybe 12, 15 minutes maximum to answer this question. Therefore, you want to make sure that you are ticking these 3 boxes, that you are following these 3 strands, but you're doing so in as few words as possible. It's really easy to get bogged down in the source and the provenance. So keep it clear, keep it concise, and make sure that you keep linking back to the question with the quote, the provenance, and the old knowledge. Remember, 3B, 3C and 3D are all based on the interpretations, interpretation 1 and interpretation 2. Of those 3, 3B is arguably the easiest. You can also use your quotes and your main argument later on for 3D, so it's quite good to plan this question out. And essentially, you need to read both interpretations, read them properly, and decide which side of the fence each interpretation lands on. So, for example, this question is about level of support towards Kristallnacht. So it's very likely that the interpretations are going to disagree. So in this case, they're probably going to disagree on the level of public support. One is going to argue that there was a lot of public support. One might argue that there was little public support, or that support for Kristallnacht was maybe forced. Let's have a look at the two interpretations. Interpretation one, if you just look halfway down, it says hatred was spreading to other parts of the population. This suggests that there was maybe a lot of support for Kristallnacht. Whereas interpretation two, you don't get a lot of space to answer this question in your exam booklet, so just keep it really, really short and to the point. Interpretation one states, use a quote, this suggests that, link back to the question, either in this case high level of support or low level of support, and then you do the exact same for interpretation two. Use a quote and then link it back to the question. 3C is a why do interpretations, or why might interpretations 1 and 2 differ. Essentially here you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of the historian, and you're trying to imagine what type of influences or what angle they are trying to argue a particular point of view from, so that you can work out why this person's opinion is different to another person's opinion. And if you ever spoke to two people about the same topic and they disagreed, chances are they've received their information from different sources, and the same is true for historians. So it's normally possible to link the interpretations to the sources that you've already spoke about in 3A. So in this case, interpretation 1 might have used source A, whereas interpretation 2 might have used source B. And as long as you explain that by giving quotes and justifying your reason, you should get all 4 marks. Now, the main question on the paper is question 3D. It is worth 60 marks plus 4 for spelling, punctuation and grammar. Now, 20 out of 52 is roughly 1/3 of the marks. Now, this is quite an important question. However, you need to fully understand the sources B and C. You need to have done 3B and 3C as well. So this is probably a question that you would do halfway in your exam. And that way you've got a really good understanding of what the sources have said and what the two interpretations have said before you decide which interpretation. And in the same way that the source question has 3 different strands, the interpretation question has 3 different strands as well. You need to be engaging with the interpretation of the material, i.e. using quotes, explaining those quotes in your own words and linking them back to the question, and where possible, talking about the tone and the language used by the historian. Are they using statistics to support their answer? Are they using people, events, dates? Are they one-sided? Are they balanced in their argument? So this is quite important. So I haven't done an introduction here or a conclusion. I've left that down to you to decide how you would structure that. But essentially, if we just have a look at these 3 strands, you can see that they have the same structure. Interpretation 1 states that, then I'm going to use a quote and explain that quote and link it back to the question. And then going to provide some supporting old knowledge, which agrees to an extent with what the historian is arguing. And then I'm going to provide my judgment at the end. You can see that on the second paragraph or the second section to your interpretation question, there is a lot more black writing, there's a lot more judgment. Now, this is really important that you decide early on which interpretation you agree with and you stick with it. You will get more marks if you explain throughout which interpretation you believe to be the more convincing, especially as you've done 3B and you've done 3C first. So you will have an idea, hopefully you'll have an idea, about which one you actually agree with, and that's what you should stick with throughout as part.